In January of 2016, I went to my first Kathy Baldock seminar. I learned many things during that seminar, but I'll share two with you. One thing that I learned, Kathy told us that we didn't know very much about human sexuality for 2,000 years. And as we came into more understanding, we started to reconfigure our ideas about looking at some of these passages. One of the things I learned there, she said that we didn't know that women had orgasms until 1956. And when she said it, she turned to the audience and said, all they had to do was ask. Another thing I learned was that the word homosexual was not in the Bible until 1946. So I began a dialogue with Kathy that continued and turned into a friendship, a very deep friendship. One day as I was researching to find out who made this decision to put the word homosexual in the Bible for the very first time in all of history, if I could have been a fly on the wall, what would I have learned? How did they process this? How did they make this decision? Was it nefarious? Was it innocent? And in my search, I found that there were 90 boxes of archived material at Yale University for the Revised Standard Version of the Bible. And Dr. Luther Weigle, who was the head of the translation team, had his personal notes and so much information there. So I applied to become a library, I'd applied for a library card, got accepted, called Kathy and told her what I found, and she said, I'm going with you. So in September of 2017, Kathy and I headed to Yale University to look through all of the archived materials. Day one was very difficult for me. It was a mountain of information, and we had so much to go through, and the hours of the library were very limited. So I was a little depressed when we went to sleep that first night, wondering if we were ever going to find this needle in a haystack. Day two, I felt like we were just 4 inches away from the information. I was very excited. I was elated. So when I went to bed the second night, I was anxiously excited to see what we would discover the next day. And on day 3, we made the discovery. And it wasn't in notes from committee meetings, it was in an exchange of letters. And it was perfect that we found it on day 3, because the first 3 days we were going through the notes in the archives, and we got to experience and get to know these 22 men who were on the RSV committee. They were very godly men. We were very impressed with their relationship with God. We saw letters and notes in the 30s where Dr. Weigle would encourage people, you need to have a woman on that committee because you're not fully representing everyone in that community without a woman. You need to have an African American on this committee because you're not fully representing everyone unless you have an African American on that committee. One lady even wrote a letter to Dr. Weigle and said, Dr. Weigle, I'm just a housewife. I'm nobody, but I have a concern. There's a poll tax in our area. Now, a poll tax is when you had to pay $1 to fill out your registration card to vote. And she said if there are poor families in our community and they have $1, they're going to spend it on food and not on a registration card. And this isn't fair. This isn't right. Could you please write to Congress and tell them, because you're a professor, you're the dean of the Yale Divinity School, you can let them know and they'll listen to you. And he responded to her and said, yes, ma'am, you're absolutely right. That is not right. That is unfair. I will definitely write to Congress. On day 3, what we found was a letter written by a 21-year-old seminary student to the translation team saying, I was reading through your Bible and I noticed that you put the word homosexual in here. I'm not sure why you did that, because everything I find, it just doesn't make sense. He wrote a 3-page single-spaced letter explaining his position with an appendix attached with studies that had been done up to that time, and this was 1959. We were excited, we were elated, because we found what we were looking for. We found the evidence and the proof, because what happened was Dr. Weigle responded in this letter, and by that time, by the 3rd day, we knew that he would have a gracious response. And he absolutely had a gracious response. And he said, yes, sir, you're absolutely right. This is something we need to reconsider, and admitted that maybe we did make a mistake and we might need to go back and change it. And sure enough, he got permission from the seminary student who wrote the letter and said, I would like to put your letter in a file so that when we come back to do any revisions, that we can talk about this and have a discussion with the translation committee and to go from there. They finally had that discussion, but they couldn't have it for 10 years because they had signed an agreement not to make any changes for publication for 10 years. And they did make a change. And they changed the word from homosexuals will not inherit the kingdom of God to sexual perverts will not inherit the kingdom of God. So people who are abusive sexually is what it was talking about, Dr. Weigle admitted. The problem was during those 10 years, the Revised Standard Version was the version that some of the other Bibles had turned to as a resource. So during the 1960s, the Revised Standard Version was in the process of changing their vote, and they voted 7-3 to remove the word homosexual from the Bible. But during that time, the Living Bible, the New International Version, and the New American Standard Bible were working on their translation notes in the 1960s as well. And they all referenced the Revised Standard Version, pulled out the word homosexual, put it in their Bibles, thinking that the Revised Standard Version had done all of the homework necessary and not knowing that the RSV translation team had changed their mind. Knowing that this is what happened on day 3 and seeing it, on day 4, when I went to bed that night, I went to bed depressed. I was there at Yale in this small room. It was a hot night, and all I could think about was all the damage that hadn't been done, the lives that had been lost, the people who had walked away from God because of this, and the people who had died and committed suicide. And I felt haunted by these people when I went to bed that night, and I didn't sleep very well. This letter by this 21-year-old seminary student is the only surviving record that explains how and why the translation team made their decision. It provided ammunition for pulpits all across the world. And the dominoes began to fall from the 1970s and forward. Since the 1970s, we've seen the largest amount of teen and young adult suicide in the history of the world. That 21-year-old seminary student is now 81 years old, and he's here tonight. Would you like to meet him?
Isn't that pretty exciting? We'll talk about how we found him in a little while, but first we're going to get some background on David. So after we found David, we started a discussion, and I've done a lot of work now in writing down his story. And so I want David to share some of his story with us tonight. All of this will appear in a book, a documentary that is called Lost in Translation, out next winter, and a book with the working title of Forging a Sacred Weapon, How the Bible Became Anti-Gay. So this story will all be in there, but tonight you get to meet David, and I think you're gonna fall in love with him like I have you, David. We have a great relationship now. So, David, would you share some of your background, where you grew up, your family legacy, where you come from?
Well, I'm from Canada, originally from the province of Quebec. My ancestors were among the first people on my mother's side. They were French-speaking settlers. Way back at the reign of Louis XV of France, and I'm not going to rehearse the history since Louis XV.
Thank you. Although we could probably benefit, Americans could probably benefit from some Canadian history. So your parents, they met at a dance on a Saturday night?
That's right, yeah. What do the young people have to do on Friday night and the weekends? No TV and no movies in those days. They went to dances where a local orchestra provided the music. And that's where my father and my mother met.
Mm-hmm. And then they settled down in this town of Lennoxville, and you come from a very moderate income family. Your father, what were your parents' professions?
Oh, my father? He was what they call an iceman back in those days. That was before refrigerators. Some of you might remember before refrigerators. No, of course not. When people had what they call ice boxes, where the iceman would come and put in a 20-pound cake of ice in the top, and the people would put their food underneath. That was in the 1950s, I would say. Late 40s, early 50s. And he was, Anyway, this town of Lennoxville is where they ended up, my parents.
And there's a nice picture of you at the age of 2, and your mom was a teacher, grade school teacher.
My mother was an elementary school teacher who had a way with children. She was dearly loved by all her kids. And my father was the iceman in this town of 6,000. People would put their card in the window, ice, if they wanted ice today. Just like they used to put the bread card in the window when they wanted the bread man to drop off.
So let's move along to when you're maybe in your adolescence and you start to figure out that you're a bit different from the other boys around you.
Yeah, so I grew up in this amazing town of Lennoxville, an English town in Quebec, which had a university established 100 years before by the Anglican, that's interpreted as Episcopal down here, the Anglican Bishop of Quebec, established Bishop's University in 1843, I think it was, and had a faculty of divinity, and later there were faculties of art, science, and commerce, and various things added. So I grew up in this town, a small town with a very well-respected university on the fringes of it. What were you asking me?
When you got to... I know his story very well. And when you got to about 12, you started to feel different than the other boys, didn't you? And then what'd you do about that?
Yeah, I went to the Lennoxville High School, and wow, that meant grade 1 to 12 in those days. They all called it the high school. And when I was about 12, I noticed that, my first crush was in grade 6. And there was this boy, Dennis, who was very, very good looking and very intelligent, and always was at the head of the class. And I greatly admired him and tried to get to know him, and his parents eventually invited me to their cottage in the summer. Well, that was that. I mean, not that I ever tried anything, just that I was attracted to him. I didn't know why. And then as I grew a bit older, I noticed, say when I was in grade 8 or 9, the boys began getting interested in the girls. And the girls to me were like sisters. I didn't feel nervous around them at all. But the other boys were kind of nervous when they were around girls. And I thought, after a while, oh, that's kind of strange. Why am I different from the other guys? And I thought, well, after a while, I realized I was becoming attracted to people of the same gender as I was. And not to girls, except they were friends, nice people, had a lot of friends who were not girlfriends, but friends that were girls.
And around this time, you also developed an anxiety. You started to...
Yeah, once I realized I was different, I thought I was the only person in the world that was attracted to not all guys, but ones that were really good looking. And
David, I've had the same problem, David.
Yeah.
But you developed a stammer around this time, which becomes
right.
significant.
Yeah. You see, some people think if you're a homosexual, you're just going to zoom in on every male person that exists. Well, we know that's not true at all. Just the same as heterosexual women don't zoom in on every man they see, I don't think.
So your stammer?
Yeah, so I began to grow more and more nervous, thinking I'm the only person like this, and I began to feel insecure and developed quite a stammer. And if the telephone rang, I would say, yes. And I was in Boy Scouts, and I was asked to be a patrol leader, unfortunately, of the Owl Patrol. And when we had inspection at the beginning of each meeting, the patrol was all lined up, and the patrol leader was supposed to say, Owl Patrol, attention. And with my stammering, I would say, attention. Well, that was another problem, but it sort of became worse and worse. Now, I was spiritually inclined, and my mother, who was a very faithful Anglican person, the three churches in our town were Roman Catholic, for a few French Catholics and Irish Catholics that were there, and Anglican and United. Those were the three mainline churches, really. And at first my mother took me to the Anglican church with her when I was 4 or 5. But then she thought David needs to go to Sunday school and learn about God at his level that children can understand. And as it happened, the Anglican church didn't have, their Sunday school was not very well organized. But the United Church, the other church in town, and United Church of Canada, by the way, is a union of Congregational, Methodist, and Presbyterian. They all came together back in 1925. And they had a very well organized Sunday school with about 60 or 70 children attending from our town. So she said, I'm going to take David to the Sunday school at the United Church. And that's the church his father supposedly belongs to, even though he was not a churchgoer, and we were lucky if we could get him out at Christmas and Easter. But he approved of our going to church, as long as he didn't have to himself.
Right.
But he believed in God in a general sort of way.
So here you are at 16, and you're in this small town, and the reason I have this book up on the screen is because this book became a very important book to you.
It became a very important book. I recognized that cover. Because I thought I was the only gay person in the world. And one day when I was walking home from school, which we used to do in those days, I stopped we had a newsstand in town, and besides newspapers, they had paperback books, which I was interested in. And one day I noticed on the top shelf a book called The Divided Path, one of the most daring novels of our time, story of a homosexual. I thought, wow, what is that? So I reached up and took a copy of the book, noticed how much it was, got out the exact change, took it quickly to the cashier, put it face down, quickly paid her the money, and rushed out with the book and went home and started reading it. And I thought, wow, I'm not the only person in the world. And just that one paperback novel opened my eyes tremendously. Right. It was a great,
So I recently found that book. I bought it on, an obscure site, and I sent you, after I read it, I sent it, to David and tried to read it through his eyes. What would a 16-year-old boy think about reading this book? Very inaccurate, as to what was going on, because homosexuality at the time was thought to be a mental illness, so you know, it wasn't a
it
fine novel.
Ended in a tragedy.
Oh, yes, and they always did. So they always had to end, like you couldn't have the homosexuals go on and live normal lives.
No.
They always had to ride off of cliffs or go to insane asylums or burn up in their house. And this one, the very last page, as he's going around the corner and they're finally going to meet at this cabin in the forest, he crashes into a tree on the very last page. But very typical, very typical.
But at least it told me.
Yeah.
There are lots of other people out there.
So the next thing is, so you start to understand that you're different than other people, and you are lucky enough, or you've been born in Lennoxville, and there's this wonderful university you told us about. So you enter university, you start as an English and history major, and in your junior year of college, you had a crisis of your faith. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, first of all, that very handsome young guy over there.
Which one, David? There's two.
The one on the right is me. And that's when I was at Bishop's University. So handy to be born in a town that has a university just on the edge of the town. And we didn't have much money. I couldn't have afforded to take a BA in Montreal or someplace. My family couldn't afford it. But I lived at home and walked back and forth, and half the kids that graduated from Lennoxville High School just went on to Bishop's. That's what we did in our town. Meanwhile, a minister came to our church, Lennoxville United Church, whose name was Dr. Leonard Outerbridge. And he had an earned PhD, and he came to Lennoxville because he was accepted as a lecturer in Far Eastern Studies at Bishop's University. He had been a missionary in China, in Shanxi province, northwest of Peking, as it was called in those days. And he was there in the 1950s when I was growing up, became a teenager and everything. And he was able to make religion and science to reconcile them and to find harmony. That if there was scientific discovery, if science discovered the earth was round rather than flat, then religion should acknowledge that. I think that's a very good example. And the same thing these days, if science finds that religion is a little different from what religion used to think way back centuries ago, then it's a favor to religion to help us understand better.
But as you were then in classes and you were learning some science, that caused you to think, what happens to me after I die? And questions of faith. So you went to Reverend Outerbridge.
Yeah. Sooner or later, probably most of us, or many of us, or some of us, do have a crisis of faith. And it was when I started at Bishop's taking courses, including some biology and science subjects, and started thinking deeply about things and the universe and all that. I thought, maybe when we die, that's it. Maybe there is no God. When you're dead, you're dead. And that was such a depressing thought. And I became depressed, and I just had to know, was there God or not? Did God exist? Or were we all just fooled by that?
So you went to see Reverend Outerbridge with this burning question.
Yeah, so I was wrestling with this. I put it in terms of, if God exists, how can I find God? Because my faith up to then was belief. I believed in God as a matter of faith, but I really didn't have an experience of God. So in my own experience, how did I know if God really existed or not? So during the Christmas holidays of my third year at Bishop's in, I think, was it 1959, That's me when I graduated
Right.
with my outfit.
So you went to him, I think, in 1957 or 8 to speak to him.
58, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Because 59 followed 58,
Right.
interestingly. Interestingly enough. And so that's when I was very confused at the end of 58. And I said, can I come and talk to you about something? So I said, sure. And I said, I'm trying to find God. And I thought he would sit me down and tell me what was what. But instead, being a very wise man, and having seen my spiritual development over my early teen years, he said, why don't you come and talk to me next Saturday? That was like a week later. So he very wisely left me a week to stew away and think about this. And I entered a period of very intense searching and praying. And my mother forced me to take piano lessons when I was a kid, which I greatly appreciated later. And I played hymns about finding God, you know. And finally, Saturday came around. I had thought I would be a teacher, like my mother and my mother's brother, my uncle, who was also a teacher. And that's what I was planning to do. I think if I was in front of a class, I wouldn't be as nervous. I was more nervous, I think, unconsciously about my sexuality. Well, I didn't realize why I stuttered so much. But I'd thought about ministry because I really developed quite spiritually. Thought about ministry, but I thought, how can I be a minister if I'm a stammerer? And to stand up in front of a whole congregation of people, I just couldn't imagine such a thing. So the following Saturday, went to talk to Dr. Utterbridge. He made an appointment for 2 o'clock in his study. And I knocked on the door and he said, come in. And I thought he was going to sit me down and have a discussion. But instead he asked me a question when I was just through the door. And he said, have you found God yet? He just threw this question at me, most unexpected. And I thought, and suddenly I had an amazing religious experience with the asking that question, and the room filled with a blinding light, just like St. Paul on the road to Damascus. And I heard like a voice, you know, if you're in communion with God and you're talking to God, maybe you're using the English language, but it's sort of mental telepathy, you know. And God was saying, I need you. I want you to do my work. And I want you to become a minister. And I said, what? You want me to become a minister? But God, don't you know that I stammer? God said, well, of course I know. I mean, I'm just interpreting, you know, the conversation. And I said, okay, but don't you know that I'm gay? And the voice came back, of course I know. I know these things, and I want you to come and do my work. And I said, well, okay, God, but I'm who I am, and I will respond and do your work. But what you're getting is what you see.
So that next week he asked you, you had decided that you would then go to McGill University, but the next week he asked you to preach.
Yeah,
which is a difficulty for a stammerer.
So all that talking with God probably happened in 10 seconds.
Right.
But it seemed like could be 15 minutes. You know, time is fluid when you're having a religious experience.
So you got up the next Sunday night in the pulpit.
And so I answered the minister's question.
Right.
Well, a voice came out of my mouth that said yes. And my brain said, hey, hold on a minute here. You're a stammerer, you know. How are you going to do this? And what happened is my spirit responded immediately to this call before my brain kicked in, you know, the mental process. It was way ahead of the mental process, but I said yes. And Dr. Outerbridge, for some reason, had application forms in his desk drawer for candidates for the ministry.
That was amazing.
I think he even had them partially filled out.
Yeah. So he trusted you the next Sunday night when the students would be traditional. The students would come back to the university on Sunday, and many of the students attended the United Church where you went, and you had to get up and give a speech and to preach, and you've got two problems going on. One, people cannot see. You're a homosexual that God has called to the ministry, but you also stammer, and that's going to be fairly obvious.
Right. The homosexual part nobody knew about. Dr. Outerbridge didn't know about, and I was not about to tell people at that time. All I knew is I felt called to do this. And so I was given the forms, and I applied to be received as a candidate, and I was received formally by my presbytery a few weeks later at their meeting, and installed, gave, answered vows and so on, and was formally accepted as a candidate for ministry. It would take I would have to do 3 years of theology after my BA.
But you're in the pulpit and you got a problem.
Okay, yeah.
This is a problem.
It takes about 2 promptings before I get to the next question.
He's a retired minister. Once you give him the microphone, he just wants to...
That's it. Once you hand me the microphone.
That's it. I should have hung on to that thing.
We had both morning and evening services in those days, before television. And a lot of students from the university came over to attend the evening service. And I loved the lovely evening services almost more than the morning service. So Dr. Outerbridge said, about the 3rd Sunday of January, I'd like you to do the address in the evening. What was the sermon in those days? And tell the people about your experience. And would you do that? And my voice said, okay. And my brain said, hey, just a minute here. But anyway, I had to go with my spirit, which is more important than the intellect. And the time came, 3 weeks later, and the church is pretty well filled. It was announced that David is going to be the speaker for the evening service. Oh, I had been active in the Sunday school and became a Sunday school teacher and was the secretary of the Sunday school as I was growing up, so I was well known in the congregation. So the evening service came, and I was pretty nervous. I was a stammerer. How was I going to do this? But God gave me the message that I don't call you to fail. I never call you to fail. I'm going to back you up. Whatever I call you to do, you're going to be able to do it with my help. So anyway, the service began, and I came up to the hymn before the sermon, and I was standing at the pulpit beside the minister, and then the hymn was over and time for my talk. And I moved over behind the pulpit, and the minister sat down, and everyone folded their arms to hear my message. And I began to speak, feeling very nervous at the beginning. And then as I got into the first sentence and the second sentence, I noticed I wasn't stammering. Not a sign of a stammer. And I began feeling more and more confident. And then I had an out-of-body experience. And I was standing beside myself and saw myself behind the pulpit. Now, this is probably a very brief experience. Again, it seems a long time. Maybe it was only seconds. And I sort of came back into my body. And I felt relaxed and hardly nervous at all, and not a sign of a stammer. So I took that as a miracle and a sign from God that what you're doing is what I called you to do, and so as a sign, I'm going to take away your stammering problem.
But he didn't take away your homosexuality, did he?
Not at all.
So,
in fact,
yeah, not at all. So,
in fact, God didn't even discuss it.
He didn't.
No, never.
Well, nobody was much discussing it in those days.
Even God didn't raise that question.
Right.
At all.
Right, because David, you knew from the time you were a child that God had called you and loved you, and it just seems like, from what I know about your story, this was already a settled issue between you and God, and removing the stammer was another sign, as you said. So now you have the call to ordination. You go to McGill University, and the book that you had grown up on the King James Version.
Yeah,
and now the book that your denomination is using is what we've talked about, the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the 1952 edition, where the word homosexual for the first time is introduced into the Bible in 1 Corinthians 6. And it used to be another way, and now David reads that the Bible in 1 Corinthians says homosexual. So what'd you do about that?
Well, when I was growing up, the only Bible anybody had was the King James Version.
Rightly so.
and that was in the early 50s, before the RSV came out. And I might have read in 1 Corinthians 6 about neither effeminate nor abusers themselves with mankind. But I never thought that ever applied to me.
Right.
I wasn't effeminate, and I wasn't an abuser with mankind.
Right.
So I didn't even consider it referred to me,
So here you see it in the RSV, and you went back to the King James.
Okay, but the point is, I never felt guilty about my feelings towards other males. I just felt perplexed.
Right.
Because in our church, it was never discussed. Sexuality was hardly ever discussed.
No, it wouldn't have been.
Homosexuality certainly was never discussed. And so at least I didn't have a feeling of guilt. Like some churches did discuss it and say it's a sin and so on and so forth. But I didn't know it was a sin. I wasn't informed that it was.
So you read that it says in 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10, it says the homosexuals won't go to heaven.
That's why it was a shock to me.
Right, and then what did you do about that?
Okay, so when I started at the McGill Faculty of Divinity, as it was called then, it's now a School of Religious Studies these days, the RSV had just come out not too long before, and now our church, United Church of Canada, was generally switching over to the RSV, and at our faculty we used the RSV. So I was just getting familiar with it, and then I came across 1 Corinthians 6, 9, and 10 that said, "Do you not know that the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived, neither shall immoral, nor idolaters, nor homosexuals." My goodness, that doesn't seem right to me. In my own experience, I thought that cannot be correct. And it bothered me. And so I looked at the front of the introduction of the Revised Standard Version to see who on earth has translated this. And I discovered that a man called Dr. Luther Weigle was the chair of the translation committee. So I thought, I'm going to write to him. Oh, and I should say, because I went to Bishop's University, and it was connected with the Anglican Church that time, and had a faculty of divinity, that New Testament Greek was offered to art students in their third and their final years, and counted as a credit toward their arts degree. So when I had decided to enter the ministry, I was still in arts, so I took New Testament Greek during my last year at Bishop. So when I went to the theological college, United Theological College, connected with McGill Faculty of Divinity, I had a bit of a step up on the study of New Testament Greek. So when I read in the RSV, nor homosexuals, but you'll notice there's a footnote, and I noticed that footnote. And it said, 2 Greek words are rendered by this translation. And I thought, I'm going to look up those Greek words, because I had the New Testament Greek Bible, or New Testament, published by the Bible Society, and I had the background books, with interlinear translations and all that. And I looked up and I found Malakos and arsenokoitai, and I thought that neither of those says homosexual, and I don't think I fit into either. Well, then I compared it with the King James Version about effeminate and abusers of themselves with mankind, and I said, I'm not an abuser of myself with mankind, and I'm not effeminate, I don't think. And now they've taken those 2 words and just called it homosexual. Well, I realized I was homosexual by then, but I certainly didn't think I fit into those, to categorize every homosexual as someone who will not enter the kingdom of God. I thought that's a terrible thing to say in a terrible translation. And what will other gay people think when they read that?
So what'd you do about it?
So I first of all looked up, did some research like you were talking about
Right.
before in the workshops we just had this afternoon, and looked up the Greek and what other biblical translations said. And I typed out a letter to Dr. Weigle, which you had up here. Yeah, that letter. Mm-hmm. My very signature. When I was sitting at my desk writing it, I never thought it would end up on a screen up here.
60 years later. So let me read parts of this letter. So just imagine now, he's 21 years old. He is just a few months into seminary at McGill University. Now, when we found this letter, we didn't obviously know he was 21. We didn't know anything. We just found this letter. On the 3rd day of our research, this letter came across the microfilm screen, and it was the only letter that we saw that had 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10 cited the words homosexual. I hadn't seen any documents with the words homosexual of 1 Corinthians 6, 9 through 10. So this letter, although it was a horrible copy on the microfilms, caught my eye. So we stopped everything. And Ed and I, we were wise enough to bring a documentarian along with us, and so he took out 2 iPhones. We stopped. As soon as I realized that the word was homosexual was in the letter, I thought, we may have found something. And so Ed moved over to the microfilm machine that I was on, and for the next 45 minutes, we read through a series of 4 letters, back and forth, back and forth. And so here's part of what David said in that first letter. Now imagine, he's 21. How old are you now, David?
How old am I?
How old are you?
I'm a mere 81.
Oh, mere. So 60 years. Actually, this letter was written 60 years ago last week. Okay?
And after 60. I wrote it, I forgot all about it.
Right.
I just did what I felt I had to do.
There you do. Just say what you got to say and you move on for 60 years. I don't tend to have that kind of patience, but we'll see. So he writes, after much study, and this is the letter written to Dr. Luther Weigle, the head of the translation team, right? Might as well go to the top. After much study in this matter, I have come to the conclusion that homosexual is not only an inadequate translation of these two Greek words that were supposed to have been used by St. Paul, but it's also a misleading and inaccurate translation. He says, I submit that the word homosexual is an inaccurate translation of malakoi and arsenokoitai, an even more inaccurate translation of the two Greek words when combined together. Now, a great many individuals who discover themselves to be homosexual in inclination, possibly from birth, are sincere, honest, and God-fearing with the highest personal moral standards. And then he writes, those who are Christian desire to follow, those homosexuals who are Christian, desire to follow the Lord Jesus Christ and to be faithful witnesses to the faith and to be workers for the kingdom as members of the universal Church of Jesus Christ. Yet these homosexuals, who are no more able to let themselves be attracted to women than normal men are able to let themselves be attracted to other men, surely these sincere Christian homosexuals are not abusers that Paul speaks of in his letter. Surely they are not the arsenokoitai. Surely Paul is speaking of the immoral, lustful man who abuses himself with other men, as surely as other men abuse themselves with women, but who are just as lustful and just as perverse in their behavior. Therefore, I consider the truly sincere Christian homosexual who has received the Holy Spirit, I submit that the word homosexual is not a justified translation of arsenokoitai. Can you imagine? He's 21, he's writing to the head of a translation team. And there's more.
Yeah, I know.
And there's more.
I just want to interject for a minute.
You wrote 3 pages. Yeah.
Yes. Anyway, that was pretty rash, wasn't it, for a first year?
Oh, we are not there
for
yet.
For a first-year theological student to write to Dr. Weigle to tell him his translation was wrong.
Yeah, the translation stinks. But you don't just tell him once, you're going to tell him in the second letter too. To render both malakos and arsenokoitai as homosexual is ridiculous. Ridiculous. If only the translators had stopped to consider it. And then he says, I am therefore intensely disappointed and concerned about this faulty and misleading translation of 1 Corinthians 6:9. I believe that this slip shows a personal prejudice and a lack of information on the part of the translators involved regarding the subject of homosexuality, and that that has affected their scholarly, scientific, and academic approach to their task in such a way as to render this inaccurate translation. He's 21, right? Last paragraph. This is 3 pages. These are only some of the highlights. He does an academic reason of what malakoi and arsenokoitai mean, of course, in there. And then he says, since this is a holy book of scripture sacred to Christians, I am more deeply concerned because of well-meaning and sincere but misinformed and misguided people, those amongst the clergy not excluded, may use the RSV translation of 1 Corinthians 6:9 through 10 as a sacred weapon, not in fact for the purification of the church, but in fact for injustice against defenseless minority group, which includes the sincere, convicted, spiritually reborn Christian who has discovered himself to be homosexual inclination from the time of his memory. I write this letter with certain homosexual individuals in mind. Perhaps. Christians who would die for their faith, their church, and their Lord, but who cannot alter the biological state of being. I hope the committee responsible for considering any possible corrections or revisions of the RSV text may take my case here presented for consideration. Very truly yours, David, and we blocked out the name. He signs it, David, name. okay? S name.
Just by the way,
Yes, sir?
I use my middle name.
Don't do that yet.
Imagine. I didn't.
Right, you did use your middle name.
In spite of my bold letter, I didn't dare use my
And why didn't you use your real
family
name?
Because if other people in our town or church, or especially at the college, the theological college, discovered who wrote to lecture Dr. Weigle on his translation, it wouldn't be very well received. And if they discovered I was gay, back at the very beginning of the 1960s, I think I'd be out in my ear.
Right. So you wrote this letter, very bold letter, and not only did you write a 3-page letter, you attached a 2-page addendum to it explaining other places he could go read in German, French, and in the UK as to research to inform himself, right? So again, now he's written it under David S., and he's written it from a P.O. box in this little town of Lennoxville, okay? Easy to find, right?
Which is 100 miles from Montreal.
Right. So a few weeks later, Dr. Weigle, less than 2 weeks later, Dr. Weigle writes back to him.
Yeah, I was amazed to get a reply.
Yeah, right. And he says that, I answered this in 1952 to somebody, and I said, I just combined arsenokoitai and malakoi into one expression and made it homosexual. No explanation as to why. So he says that again. And then he adds on this letter, and now this one is written back to David. David wrote on October 22nd. This one is written to him on November 3rd, and it said, in view of the care with which you have studied this matter and your evident concern, I'm going to write to you more fully. And you know what? We now had a historical document, because now the head of the translation team is going to explain exactly how they came to this decision. Now, this is the only piece of recorded history. Nothing else is in the notes. So 7 years after the Bible comes out, he is asked a very astute question with a lot of detail of why you did this, and I think you made a mistake. So he takes this seriously. He writes back a 3-page letter to David, and he sends in with that 2 pages of worksheets of how he made this translation. So suddenly Ed and I had the historical document that we didn't even know would exist. I mean, we went not knowing what to find. So he says, I'm going to answer you more fully. So he says, the basic question is how to translate the Greek term malakos. That was not the basic question. There's a little glitch in here that in the meantime, a Greek to English lexicon had come out that was published in 1957 that definitively said that arsenokoitai equals homosexual. So now in 1959, Weigle is answering this question, and he says, look right here, in the BDAG lexicon, it says arsenokoitai equals homosexual. Yeah, but the problem was that book was translated from a German translation and inappropriately translated. The German translation said that word should be boy molester. When the person translated from Greek to German to English, he made arsenokoitai say homosexual. So now Luther Weigle is sitting in 1959 and he says, there's no conversation about arsenokoitai because this lexicon says it's homosexual. So let's talk about malakoi, which is not the problematic word. So he starts to explain malakoi, and he answers and he gives all these details that now I can trace. I actually spent 2 weeks going through these letters, all the documents that both of them used to trace this. And so Dr. Weigle then adds at the end, he says, I am quite willing, because he says, one part of the letter, these words should not be combined. I get what you're saying, and I get what you're saying. I'm not talking about the homosexuals that are born that way. I'm essentially talking about the homosexual ones that do the vices, the rapists, homosexual rapists, those that use and abuse others. There's heterosexual abusers and there's homosexual abusers. He says, those are the ones I'm talking about. And he said, I'm quite willing to have the committee consider that question whether our present rendering is ambiguous and should be clarified. It is quite possible that we ought to substitute the word homosexual with some phrase such as, those who indulge in homosexual practices. Would that seem objectionable to you, he writes to David? So he ends the letter by letting David know he's going to put the letter in the file for the translation team to look at when they next look at translations. Problematically, the translation team isn't going to deal with this until 1969. They had already dealt with significant criticisms and suggestions that had come in between 1952 and summer of 1959. And they came out with an RSV-r with the corrections that they agreed with the publisher on October 1st to not make any more changes to the RSV for 10 more years. October 1st, 1959. And David writes his letter on October 22nd, 1959. So at the end, he says, he signs it off and he says, with hearty appreciation of your interest and cooperation, I am sincerely yours, Dr. Luther Weigle. So you were pretty surprised to get this letter, were you not?
I was really astonished. I thought he might have said something like, I take note of your letter and thank you for your interest.
Right.
Very truly yours.
So then David writes back again. That's not good enough, because the first letter he thought it was ridiculous, and Weigle says, yeah, I'll look at it. So David writes back and said, perhaps I should point out that I am as yet a student in seminary, tips his hand, and I must admit listen to these humble words, I must admit my inadequacies of knowledge and education in this field. When you all get to see the letter when the book is published, you're going to read this and laugh, because it's inadequacies. My goodness, when Ed and I first found this letter, I just stepped back and I thought, I'm not sure most people educated in this field today could have written a similar letter. It was that good 60 years ago. And he said, still I pray this will not cause you or the committee, this is David, still I pray this will cause you not cause you or the committee to consider the matter I raise any more lightly. However, I believe still that one word homosexual is inadequate and is in a real sense erroneous. After seriously considering each of the possible expressions mentioned in the letter before, and any others that came to mind, and after considering also the information you kindly gave me as to how he substantiated this, I wish, David's not going to let it go there. He said, I wish to make this proposal as to the best phrase, which I am able to conceive as the translation of the two words, those who practice homosexual vices. At the time, this means homosexual rape. David ends the letter back to Weigle saying, I do wish to express my most sincere appreciation to you, Dr. Weigle, and to the Standard Bible Committee for your attention in considering my objection, put forth as it is so clumsily and unscholarly a manner. Most sincerely yours, David S. So now we're in a place where David has suggested those who participate in homosexual practices, and Weigle has suggested that, and David has said no, it should be homosexual vices.
Yeah, not practices, but
right, vices, and it should be. You see, you're still correcting in a scholarly and humble manner, and then the exchange ends, and Dr. Weigle says, "Okay, I get you. I get that you say it's homosexual vices. It's an abuse of sex. I'm going to put it in the file." And that's when it gets put in the file until the next revision. And the interesting thing is when the committee gets together in 1969 and decides to do another revision, it's 10 years later, they don't go with homosexual practices or homosexual vices. It's 10 years later, and they know that homosexuals are not, we're starting to understand they're not mentally ill, they're coming out of the closet, activism is just starting, and he says he's going to carefully consider this, and when the team gets together and considers it, they don't use either of those suggestions. They now retranslate and correct it to sexual perverts, which is not a group of people. I have heard that there are heterosexual people that sometimes participate in sexual perversions. I mean, I think that there are heterosexual people that do this. It has been known. It has been known. It has been known. So it's no longer a group of people, it's a person that does abusive sex. So now the letters are in the files. Ed and I discovered them 60 years later. But did you save those letters?
What's that?
Did you save the letters, the exchange back and forth to Luther Weigle?
Well, I'm sort of a pack rat, and they're somewhere in my filing cabinet. But I hadn't seen them for years.
Had anybody ever asked you about those letters?
No, because nobody knew.
Right, nobody knew you even wrote those letters. So you went on to be a pastor, and here you are after your ordination, actually, and that's the Cloisters in Upper Manhattan. And when we looked at these dates, David and I laughed because 1/3 a mile away from there, my grandparents' house was. I grew up in New York City, and we could see the Cloisters from my grandparents' apartment, and this was clearly taken in the summer. And I said, David, I was young, I was about 5 or 6, and I spent the summers with my grandparents in the Cloisters Park. So we were probably about 1/3 of a mile apart from each other at that point. There we are. So you've just been ordained, and now you get your first calling to a small town. Tell me about that.
Well, in our church, those who are first ordained are required to serve their first 2 years, minimum of 2 years, wherever they're assigned. So they have these ordinands that they're able to send to difficult to fill places. We had both the settlement system and the call system. And if we had only the call system, nobody would want to go to Labrador in the far northeast of Canada, practically on the edge of the Arctic. And so they settled people on difficult to fill pastoral charges, as we call them. And I was still single, and they were glad I was still single because they could send me up to Labrador. And Labrador City was a mining town that was just being developed, where they had discovered iron ore. And they were just building a town site. And meanwhile, the workers came mainly from the island of Newfoundland, where the United Church is quite strong. And they had bunkhouses for the men. And meanwhile, they were building the town site, street by street, and building houses. And as the houses became available, the men could bring their families up. But they had a trailer court, on the fringes of the city, about 80 trailers, where some of the people could bring their families, and where the United Church had purchased a trailer for the minister to live in. And I was the first ordained minister there, to go there. And just 2 trailers away was the Salvation Army captain, because they had a congregation there too. And we became very good friends. I was also very good friends with the Anglican minister there.
Was it lonely up there? I mean, here you are, English speaking in a French settlement, a single pastor, a young man. Did it ever get you down?
Well, I felt terribly isolated. There's no road into the place. Well, there is now, but that was years ago when they were just starting out. The only way in was by air, and there was just an airstrip where the planes could land. And then winter was not too bad in the autumn, but in the fall, the winter came in November, and the lake froze up. It was Lake Wabash there. And I began to feel terribly isolated. Not too bad the first year, but when it got round to the second year, here I was all by myself, having to keep my trailer somewhat organized, not enough room to put all my books, so I had to stack them up. We didn't have Google to ask questions to in those days, so we had to look in books to find out things and do my pastoral duties. And besides that, I had to go over about 150 miles to the hydroelectric development at Churchill Falls to do a midweek service over there in the bunkhouse with the eggs sizzling in the background. And the Anglican minister and myself took turns going over every second.
So at some point you took a break and you went back to Montreal and you met somebody.
Yeah, so December of the last year I was there, had 2 weeks of Christmas holidays, so I decided to go out. You know, you have cabin fever after a while. And in Montreal, by now I knew an older gay person who was not at all, pushy or coming on to me, but just a real friend. And he said, I know a young fellow who happens to be the same age as you are, and I think you might like to meet him. So he introduced me to Joe. And Joe turned out to be someone who had a severe kidney disease, had to go to hospital frequently for tests and so on, and was not able to do regular employment, but he had taken a course and become a nursing assistant. And he loved being around churches, and when he was just a kid, he used to help the janitor at his church. And when he discovered, somehow he thought I was kind of interesting. I didn't think I was handsome when I was young, and I was a minister, about 21 or something, 24, same age as him. And I said, gosh, my trailer's a terrible mess, I just don't have time to look after it.
That's quite a pickup line.
I didn't catch that.
I said that's quite a pickup line.
Yes.
My trailer's a mess, come help me.
Yeah. Anyway.
So did he come to your trailer?
So Joe said, when you go back after your holidays, why don't I go with you? And I'll look after your trailer. I'll get your trailer all fixed up. And so he agreed to come for 2 weeks.
And what did the ladies in town think of that?
Oh, yes.
Oh.
Anyway, he agreed to come for 2 weeks. And he was with me for 23 years.
So Joe went from the next... Okay, go ahead and tell us what the ladies in town thought.
Yes. So the ladies in town were kind of bored. There was no TV or anything. So at card parties and sewing circles, they liked the gossip of the town. They exchanged all the gossip of the town. And they said, I heard the minister has someone staying with him now. And someone said, I think it's his cousin. And then the gossip got round to me. And I thought, I don't think I'll just interfere with that statement.
So Joe was with you for all those years in a relationship through you served in 7 pastorates.
That's right.
And tell us about when the year Joe died and about his elaborate funeral that he insisted on.
Okay. Joe was fully accepted by the people of the town. He was very outgoing in his personality, a little bit on the femme side. But the people didn't mind at all. They said, he's really looking after the minister, and that's a wonderful thing. So now the minister can pay his full attention to his pastoral duties. And he fixed up the mess in his trailer. Well, good for him, And first thing I knew, Joe was discussing recipes with the ladies. So anyway, he was fully accepted.
And what?
And then when I moved.
But what year did he die, and what did he ask for?
So he went with me to my next place, which was near Montreal. And he was fully accepted by the congregation there. And I think people loved him more than they did me. And finally, a third charge, halfway between Montreal and Ottawa. And then finally, I was called down to the southwestern Ontario, to an old Victorian village. And he was with me, and that's where he passed away after 23 years,
right,
in 1986. But Joe knew that he was dying. Finally, he had been on, what do they call it,
Kidney dialysis.
Kidney dialysis. And he knew he was dying, but he wasn't worried about it. He had very strong faith. He felt God was with him. But he said, because he was a little bit flamboyant, he said, when I die, I would like to have my funeral back at this town near Montreal. This is the third pastoral charge where we were for 7 years, in kind of a rural town. And on that charge, I had the town church and a country church. And at the country church, there was an old churchyard behind the church overlooking the Ottawa Valley. Lovely location. And he got along wonderfully with the farming folk in that area. And he said, I'd like to be buried in that cemetery, which was near Montreal, so his family could come and visit his grave if they wanted to. And the cemetery in Montreal, Mount Royal, was like miles and miles and miles, and it'd take half a day just to find where he was buried. So he wanted to be in one of his favorite towns. And he said he wanted to have a big funeral with a big procession and really to go out with a big flare, So those are his last wishes. So I arranged. His body was transported to this town, and the funeral director had a very fancy limousine for families that they could rent if they wanted, rather than me driving my Volkswagen behind. So I thought Joe would like to have this big limousine. And some of his family came up from Montreal, to be at his funeral. So we all rode in the big limousine behind the funeral coach. And when I looked behind, there were cars in the procession for at least half a mile back. And practically the whole town remembered when Joe was there and wanted to come to his funeral.
Right.
And he had the kind of funeral he was really wanting to go out with a big flare.
So after that, we're going to fast forward to you eventually serve 37 years in the ministry, 7 pastorates, and you retire. And you retire in 99, and you move to Western Canada in 2001. And before we have you sitting in Canada. You're very productive, but you're just sitting in Canada. You've forgotten about this letter, but Ed and I haven't forgotten about this letter. And the night that we found this letter, we wondered who this person was this person still alive? So one of the people I want to acknowledge right now is the person that found him is a person named Tina Wood, and she's here. And Tina, would you give us about 2 minutes to tell us how you found it? Well, this is the guy you found. This is your guy.
Well, I'll try to keep this short. I'm a longtime gay activist, which is how I know Kathy from Facebook. When I read about the work she did, I'm like, oh, she's wonderful. I want to be friends with her. So that's how I knew her. And I live in Rhode Island, so it's about 2 hours to Yale. And so that's when I got to meet her in person when she was doing this work. It was actually the day before they found the letter. So in my other work, I help adoptees and birth families who are searching and trying to find their families. So I told Kathy about this work, so she knew I knew how to find people, and said, can you find this man? And I said, well, I'll try. Canada is really hard. They actually respect their citizens' privacy in Canada, unlike in the US. So they don't have those fancy databases you can pay $10 to stalk anybody you want, like we do here. So I tried and tried with the name that he used, his middle name, which I thought was his last name. The very first place I looked was, in fact, Bishop's University, which is where he was before. And they were very nice and said, no, we never had a student named David S. I won't say the name. So I'm like, well, that was my best lead. What am I going to do now? And I tried all these things. I reached out to people in Quebec with that last name. Nobody wrote back. Several librarians tried to help me. Nothing. And finally, I asked Kathy, can I see part of these letters? Maybe there'll be some clues in them. And I ascertained from reading the letters that this was a Canadian, not an American, who for some reason was in Canada, because of the way the letters, the words were spelled, with the extra U's, whatever. I said, okay, he's Canadian. And it didn't sound like he was Catholic, because really we had no clue of this. I said, okay. And I figured he probably wasn't Anglican either, because it sounded very much like, United Church of Canada. I said, okay. Well, I happen to have a friend who is also a retired minister in United Church of Canada. Her name is Judith. And as it turned out, I did not even know when I thought to ask her that she was actually from Quebec also. She lives in Nova Scotia now, and the entire time I've known her, she's lived in Nova Scotia. So I wrote her a very long email explaining the situation and saying, I'm pulling my hair out about the search. Is there any kind of gay network of clergy in your denomination that maybe you know somebody who knows somebody, This long email I sent, she wrote me back in bullet points. It was actually very funny that it was so terse. But the last thing she said was, if he was in the ordination stream, he might have used a fake name. It would have been prudent. And I'm like, oh no, he's used a fake name. That's probably exactly how am I going to find this guy? And she said, I'm almost sure he would have gone to Bishop's if he was living in Lennoxville. Don't look at the French university that's nearby there. I'm sure that's not it. So I started looking in the yearbooks for the time period and going page by page, making notes on people I thought I might need to research later, and turned the page, the virtual page online. They had scanned their yearbooks, and I saw David S. and then a different last name, and the S was the name that we were given. And if you could have seen the look on my face. And I was like, oh my God. And so I researched him and found that, yes, indeed, United Church of Canada, and got his contact information and sent it to Kathy with a long explanation of all this, and there's stuff I'm leaving out that you don't need to know. Yes, of course. I hope I'm doing right by you. Okay. And I said, okay, Kathy, this is why I think it's him. And, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm about 90% sure. And here's his phone number, here's his email, here's his address. You make the call. And she did. And she'll tell you more about that momentarily.
Give it up for Tina, who found right? Thank you, sweetie. So she's kind of a night owl, and she sends it to me, and the next morning I wake up, and there's this email, and she says, I'm almost sure I got your guy. So on August 9th, 2017, I called you, David. And what'd you think? And we're almost to the end of this. So what'd you think? And now what do you think about that you're the guy that wrote this letter?
Well, my phone rang at about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I was thinking about getting up around that time. And the phone is right beside my bed. And this person said, my name is Kathy, and did you write a letter to Dr. Weigle 59 years ago or something? And I hadn't thought about it for all this time, more than half a century. Right. Suddenly, zap, there was a connection from the past up to, when was it, 2018?
Right.
August of 2018. And it was like a connection through time. And suddenly it all came flooding back, all that. And I said, Yes, I did write a letter those years ago.
So what has been wonderful about this is that it's miraculous, right? First of all, that we found this letter, and that Tina found the guy, and that, sorry, David, he's still alive.
Yeah, I'm kind of glad to hear that.
Yes, you're still alive. And when I knew that I wanted to include his story, well, when we found out who he was and details about his life, that I wanted to include him in this book as a through story in the book. I also then needed his permission to publicly out him, because David had stayed publicly. Some people knew he was gay, but he wasn't publicly out. So last year we brought him to the GCN conference, and in a room full of people he got up, and at the age of 80 he publicly came out as a gay Christian. So, David, now that you see that this is what your life has culminated in, that you are the guy that wrote this one letter that we truly believe will unravel this unjust and wrong translation that was admitted to be wrong as soon as it was challenged, you're the guy. So what's your life been about? What do you think?
Well, after your phone call, I began to realize that I used to think I was called to pastoral ministry in spite of being gay. And I decided after your phone call that I was called to ministry because I was gay. Oh, I'm glad so many of you can really resonate with that. It's so true.
Because of the obedience and curiosity of a young 21-year-old that had the courage and the academics and the life experience to challenge this letter, we now have a tool to academically and in authenticity start to dismantle this error that has persisted on translations. So I don't know, Darren, do we have any time for questions, or are we done? Okay, we have no time for questions, but he is now here until the end. And I want to also acknowledge that Reverend Richard, would you just stand up for 1 second? Reverend Richard also was in seminary at the same time David was in the 50s as a closeted gay man at McGill Theological Seminary as well. And because Reverend Richard lives in Western Canada and they had become friends, when David retired, he moved there. And Reverend Richard has come down here to escort David to the conference. Reverend Richard is a married gay man, a married gay retired pastor in Vancouver. So as you see these two this weekend, yes, you may, hold on. You're going to tell us about his holes in his pants?
It's wonderful being an acolyte to an old friend. It's really wonderful to be part of David's experience here. I just thought I'd share an amusing vignette. I have some claim in the reason that David is a confessedly homosexual man. And it goes back to seminary in Montreal. And one day, I was walking up the stairs, and I saw this rather good-looking young man coming towards me.
Me?
And yes. And on the spur of the moment, it really wasn't in my personality, I bent over and kissed his cheek. And in that silence, God spoke to him, and I think we've been good friends ever since.
So as you see these two for the next few days, remember, treat them as pieces of history. They have done wonderful things 60 years ago. And please just sit and spend some time with them. And we're about to wrap, do you have anything else you want to say? Mr. History, Mr. Fame?
Just very briefly, I want to say that as my life unfolded, one event followed another event and so on. But now from this perspective, as I look back over my life, I see an amazing pattern that happened. That I was born and grew up in the town of Lennoxville, a most remarkable town with a university on the edge of it. I was able to get my BA there, live at home, and then when I did my MDiv at McGill, the United Church paid the fees for all their students and even assisted with our board. I mean, like room and board. And so it was not a question of being able to afford it. That was all unfolded. And then when I went to Labrador, I felt almost on the edge of suicide. I was so depressed. And then it's as if I prayed, God, what am I going to do up here? And so I really believe God sent Joe along. And he happened to be a very jealous type, which was probably a good thing because it kept me on the straight and narrow. And God thought, I'm going to send someone who's a little bit on the jealous side to look after David, which he did for 23 years. And that's remarkable. And it's remarkable that people in all the congregations accepted him. I was never asked, was I gay or not? And I thought if anyone asked me, I would say, well, that's a personal matter, which is a nice way of saying, mind your own business.
So we have to do a hard end here, David.
So I'm sorry that I was so talkative. It's like a sermon that goes over time, which has been known to happen in my past. But just before we close, I want to mention this book that I discovered.
This is his idea.
Now, all that I told you was before I ever heard of Kathy and before I ever heard of this book. And I have to say, it took me a few months in my available time to read through it, that every word that she discovered in here, I had discovered in my own research and in my own experience. And it accords 100% with my experience. And I think it's a foundational book, a basic book on sexual orientation and religious belief and faith. That now Kathy hasn't told me to say that. She's even trying to cut me off already.
Okay, enough. Okay.
And everyone should have it. If you don't have it, this is the basic book.
So this is the man. So this right here. So grab him anytime this weekend. He has a lot of history, but we have much to be thankful for, that he wrote the letter, that we found the letter, and that we found him, and he is here to share his experience and knowledge with you. As I say about David S., real last name, he is like the perfect grandfather that everybody wants, and the perfect retired minister. Get to know him and Reverend Richard. They are wonderful people, and we are very thankful. Please.
And I have to say, I'm just overwhelmed by your reception.
Thank you.